Okay, we are going to continue on. Let's look at the next one. This one says last year, Mr. Peterson had a rectangular garden that had a width of 4 meters and an area of 32 square meters. This is last year. This year, he wants to make the garden 3 times as long and 2 times as wide. Solve the length of last year's garden using the area formula. Then draw and label the measurements of this year's garden. So let's see here. Here we go. Okay, so this is actually going to be, we're going to put this over here to last year because it says, let me get it, it's getting your line. It says Ms. Peterson's rectangular garden had a width of 4 meters and an area of 32 square meters. Well, there's our 32 square meters. And we know the width was 4 meters. Okay. And then we know this year, sometime this year, he wants to make one that's 3 times as long, right? And then we know it's going to be 2 times as wide. Okay, so we know that much. Okay, so right now we know that the width is 4. So if we're saying 2 times as wide, I can already figure that out. 4 and 4. So we know the width of it's going to be 8 of the new garden. Okay, so I need to figure out what the length of this is in order to be able to do it 3 times as long. So if I know area equals length times width, so I would just think like this. I'd say area, we know the area is 32. Okay, and we don't know the length, but we know the width is 4. So I have to think what times 4 gives me 32. If I was singing the song of the fours, I would just do it 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, 32. So I know it's 8. Okay, so that's the length, the missing thing. It's going to be 8 meters. Okay, so if I know it says this year he wants to make one 3 times as long and 2 times as wide, well, we've got the 2 times as wide, so we know it's 8. 3 times as long as this one, we're going to have to do 8, 8, and 8. Okay, so let's figure that out for the length. I can just do my song of the 8s, 8, 16, 24. Or I could add 8 3 times, or I could multiply 8 times 3, 24 meters. Okay, so solve the length of last year's garden using the area formula, draw and label the measurements of this year's garden. So we did that. The next part says, how much area for planting will Mr. Peterson have in the new garden? So this is this year's, and we're trying to figure out the area. And we know area equals length times width. Well, what did we say the length was for this year's garden? 24. And the width of this year's garden is 8. So we're going to be doing 24 times 8. Let's just do the standard algorithm. 24 times 8. 8 times 4, 32. Okay, and then 8 times 2 is 16. Plus 3 more, 17, 18, 19. So I have 192. So how much area for planting will Mr. Peterson have in the new garden? I would just say Mr. It's funny because it says he and it says Ms., but it's really supposed to be Mr. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and keep going with this. Mr. Peterson has 192, and we always do squared units, so we're going to say squared meters for his garden. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at the next one. All right, let me clear this. Whoops. Okay, looking at this next one, it says last year, Mr. Peterson had a fence all the way around his garden. He can reuse all of the fence he had around the garden last year, but he needs to buy more fencing to go around this year's garden. How many more meters of fencing does he need for this year's garden than last year? So we've got several things going on here. We know he had a fence all the way around his garden. So when you go all the way around, I think immediately of perimeter. We know that he can reuse that fence that he had last year, but he needs to buy some more. So, and then they're asking how many more meters does he need for this year? So we have last year, and we just figured out on last year's, okay, so last year's we had, 8 and 4, okay? So if we know that this side is 8, we know this side is 8. And if we know this side is 4, we know this side is 4 when we're talking about perimeter. And perimeter, if we're trying to figure out the perimeter of last year's garden, perimeter is 2 times the length plus the width. Or you could just say 8 plus 4 plus 8 plus 4. But let's just do it this way. So 2 times 8 plus 4, or 2 times 12, which we know is 24 meters. Okay, and then we're talking about this year's garden, which we just figured out on the last problem. It was 8 and 24. So if this side's 24, I know this side's 24. And if this side's 8, I know this side is 8. Okay, so let's figure out the perimeter for this year's garden. Okay, so we've got 2 times the length plus the width. So 2 times 24 plus 8. Okay, or 2 times 32, which we know is the perimeter is 64 meters. All right, so now that we figured out the perimeter, which is all the way around last year and this year's garden, he wants to reuse some of this fence that he had last year for this year. Obviously 24 is not enough to make a whole fence that is 64 meters. So they're asking how many more meters of fencing is needed for this year's garden than last year. So what are we going to do there? We're going to subtract. He needs 64. We're going to subtract our 24. So 0, 4. So he needs 40 meters more. So then we're just going to answer that like this. Mr. Peterson will need 40 meters more of fencing this year to go with last year's. Okay. All right, that's our review.